Elena moved quietly through the busy restaurant, balancing trays filled with sparkling glasses and steaming plates. The lights above were warm and golden, reflecting off the marble floors and shining tables. Laughter and music floated in the air. People dressed in fine clothes talked about business and travel and expensive dreams. But no one noticed the young waitress weaving between the tables. To them, she was part of the background. Another face in uniform, polite and invisible. Elena had worked there for almost a year. She came in early, polished silverware, set tables, and stayed late to clean after the last guest had gone home. Her shoes always hurt, her back always ached. But she never complained. There was a calmness about her, the kind that made her coworkers trust her. If someone was late or forgot an order, Elena quietly fixed it. If a customer was rude, she smiled and moved on. Everyone liked her, but no one really knew her. At the corner of the restaurant stood a grand piano. It was glossy and black, shining under the chandelier every night. A hired pianist played soft jazz and classical tunes while guests dined. Elena loved those moments the most as she passed by with her tray. Her eyes would always drift toward the piano. Her fingers twitched slightly, remembering the feeling of keys beneath them. But she never touched it to the others. It was just part of the decor. To her, it was a doorway to a life she had lost. Before working here, Elena had been a music student. She had studied piano since she was a child. Her father, a mechanic, had saved for years to buy her a second-hand keyboard, he used to say. These hands were made for music, and she believed him. She practiced for hours every day, learning the great pieces, Beethoven, Chopin, Debussy. Her dream was to perform on a grand stage one day. But dreams can be fragile things. When her father passed away suddenly, everything changed. Her mother fell ill, the bills piled up, and soon Elena had to drop out of music school. She sold her piano to pay rent, and the silence that followed broke her heart. Now her music lived only in her memory. Sometimes, after a long shift, she would hum softly while wiping tables. The melodies she once played danced faintly in her mind. Her coworkers teased her gently, saying she was always lost in her thoughts. They didn't know that her thoughts were filled with music, notes, rhythms, and feelings that had no place in her current life. The restaurant became her stage, though no one clapped and no one listened. On weekends, when the restaurant was especially busy, Elena barely had time to breathe. She moved like a shadow, fast and silent. Sometimes, a guest would smile at her. Sometimes they wouldn't even look up. She had learned not to expect kindness, only to give it when she went home late at night. The city streets were empty. She would walk to her small apartment, her shoes clicking softly on the pavement. The sound reminded her of metronome beats, steady, patient, endless. Inside her room, there was no piano, no luxury, just a small desk, a chair, and a photo of her father. But there was something else, a small keyboard she had bought from a thrift store, missing 2 keys. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her who she was. Every night she sat by the window, closed her eyes, and played softly. She didn't care that the keys stuck or that the sound was uneven. In those moments, she wasn't a waitress. She was Elena, the pianist who still had dreams. Her neighbors sometimes heard the faint melodies drifting through the walls. They never complained. They said it made them feel peaceful. It made Elena smile, knowing her music still touched someone, even if just for a little while. Back at the restaurant, life went on the same way every day. Orders shouted from the kitchen, glasses clinking, laughter echoing through the hall. The piano stood silent most mornings, covered in a thin layer of dust until evening. Elena often wiped it clean while setting tables, running her cloth gently over the keys. Her manager once joked, "You treat that thing like it's yours," she smiled and said, "Maybe it's waiting for someone to play it again." He laughed and walked away, not knowing how true her words were. Sometimes when the pianist took a break, Elena would pause near the piano. She imagined sitting there, under the chandelier, the crowd listening. Her hands would rest lightly at her sides, her heart beating faster. She could almost hear the music inside her head, ready to come alive, but then someone would call her name, and the dream would vanish like smoke. She would pick up her tray and return to work. Her secret stayed hidden beneath her quiet smile. To the world, Elena was just another waitress, polite and hard-working, but inside her lived a story that was waiting for its moment. Every plate she carried, every glass she polished, was part of a quiet rhythm. Her rhythm. She didn't know that soon. Fate would give her one chance to play again. One night that would change everything. The night when the quiet waitress would no longer be invisible. The night when her music would finally be heard. A night that would be remembered forever. The night after her long shift, Elena sat by her window again, her small keyboard glowing softly in the dark. Outside, the city lights flickered like tiny stars trapped in glass buildings. She closed her eyes and began to play, letting her fingers move slowly. The tune was gentle, sad, yet full of warmth, like a memory that refused to fade. For a moment it felt like time had stopped, like the world outside didn't matter anymore. Music had always been her language, the only way she knew how to speak her heart. When words failed her, the piano never did. Every key carried her emotions, her fears, her hopes, her hidden dreams, even though her life had changed. The music inside her never left. It waited patiently like an old friend, ready to be heard again. When she was a little girl, Elena would spend hours listening to her father's radio. They would sit together, her head resting on his shoulder as soft classical pieces played. Her father would say, "Close your eyes, Lena. Can you see the story inside the sound?" She would nod and imagine worlds built from music. Rivers of violins, mountains of drums, skies of piano keys. Those were the moments that made her believe she could create something beautiful too. She began learning piano at a small community center. The piano there was old and chipped, but she loved it as if it were gold. Her teacher, Mrs. Novak, saw her passion immediately. She would often say, "Elena, you don't just play notes, you feel them." That small compliment became a light in Elena's heart, guiding her through the years that followed. When she was accepted into a music conservatory, it was the happiest day of her life. She called her father crying with joy, and he laughed proudly on the phone. For a few years, life felt like a song, full of rhythm and promise. But fate had its own melody, one that wasn't always kind. When her father passed away suddenly, the music inside her grew quiet. Grief is heavy, and silence became her companion. She tried to keep studying, tried to hold on to her dream, but with bills piling up and her mother growing weaker, she had no choice. She left the conservatory, packed away her sheet music, and began working wherever she could. She told herself it was temporary, that she'd return to music one day, but days turned into months, and months into years. Soon even hope began to fade, replaced by the rhythm of trays and dishes instead of piano keys. Yet the universe has strange ways of testing people. Sometimes it hides your dreams only to see if you'll chase them again. And even in the noise of the restaurant, her soul still hummed. She could hear melodies in the clinking of glasses, the laughter, the footsteps. It was as if life itself played a background tune, reminding her who she really was. One afternoon, while polishing silverware, she noticed the restaurant's grand piano again. It stood quietly in the corner, untouched since morning. Sunlight from the window hit its surface, making it glow like something alive. Elena's hand brushed over the lid, her fingertips trembling. A sudden rush of emotion filled her chest, longing, fear, love, all at once. For a second, she wanted to lift the lid, to feel the weight of the keys beneath her fingers again. But then she heard the manager's voice calling her from across the hall, and just like that, the moment vanished. That night, as she was leaving, she heard the cleaning crew laughing near the piano. One of them jokingly pressed a few keys, making random sounds. They all laughed, but to Elena, even those clumsy notes meant something. They were like echoes from her past, whispering softly, "You still belong here." She smiled sadly and walked out into the cold night air, her heart heavy but alive. When she reached her apartment, she couldn't sleep. Something inside her was stirring, louder than before. She turned on her tiny keyboard and began to play again, this time with tears in her eyes. Her hands moved faster, freer, stronger. Every note carried a piece of her story, the pain of losing her father, the weight of sacrifice, the quiet strength she had found. And as the music filled her small room, something magical happened. It didn't sound broken anymore, it sounded alive, like the piano itself was reminding her, "You are still a musician." The next day, she arrived at work early, before anyone else. She stood near the piano again, the restaurant still empty and quiet. She looked around to make sure no one was watching. Then she gently lifted the lid, her fingers shaking as she touched the keys. They were cold and smooth under her hands, like touching an old friend after years apart. She pressed one key softly, then another and another. A simple melody formed, faint but beautiful. echoing through the empty hall. Her heart raced, her eyes filled with tears. It had been years since she had touched a real piano, and in that moment everything she had buried came rushing back. She didn't hear the manager walk in behind her. He stood there for a moment, surprised, listening. When she noticed him, she froze, ready to apologize, but he didn't look angry, just curious. "Didn't know you could play," he said softly. Elena smiled nervously. "It's been a long time," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "You've got talent, kid. Maybe you should play for the guests someday." She laughed quietly, shaking her head. "Oh no, I'm just a waitress now." But deep down, a small spark lit again, a spark that would soon turn into a fire. That night, as she walked home, her steps felt lighter. The city didn't seem so cold anymore because she knew her music wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the right moment to return. And when that moment came, it would change everything. The world would finally hear what the quiet waitress had been holding inside all along. Her hidden talent was no longer asleep. It was waking up, ready to sing again. The evening began like any other Friday night, but something in the air felt different. The restaurant glowed brighter than usual, every chandelier shining like stars. The tables were set with silver cutlery, crystal glasses, and soft white candles that flickered gently. The staff moved quickly, their footsteps echoing across the marble floor. Everyone knew tonight was important, a special event, a private gala for the city's wealthiest guests. Elena arrived early, tying her hair neatly and adjusting her apron. She could feel the tension around her. The way everyone spoke in hushed, hurried tones. The manager, Mr. Collins, walked back and forth, giving out instructions with a serious face. "The guests tonight are high profile," he said. "No mistakes, no delays. Everything must be perfect." Elena nodded quietly, clutching her order pad like it was part of her uniform soul. Rumor spread among the staff that one of the guests was a famous music producer, a man who had discovered singers and pianists who now performed around the world. The name meant little to Elena at first, but something about it stirred a feeling deep inside her. She wondered what it would be like to perform in front of someone like that. Then she smiled faintly, shaking the thought away. She was here to serve food, not dreams. By 7 o'clock, the first guests arrived. Luxury cars pulled up outside, their doors opening to reveal men in tailored suits and women in glittering gowns. The air filled with perfume, laughter, and the quiet sound of expensive shoes on marble. The pianist began to play softly in the corner, smooth notes flowing like silk through the room. It was the kind of night that made the restaurant feel like another world. Elegant, untouchable, distant. Elena moved gracefully between tables, her steps careful, her smile gentle. She balanced trays of champagne and appetizers as conversations buzzed around her. Investments, charity events, vacations in Italy. She heard snippets of luxury she couldn't imagine. But she didn't envy them. She only watched, silently, like a ghost among diamonds. Once, as she passed the piano, she slowed for just a heartbeat. The music was lovely, but it lacked something. Soul, warmth, a heartbeat. She closed her eyes for a moment, hearing how she would play it differently. Then she opened them quickly and moved on, reminding herself she didn't belong at that piano. Hours passed and the night continued smoothly. Dishes were served, glasses refilled. Laughter grew louder. The pianist kept playing, his hands moving with practiced grace. But near the middle of the evening, Elena noticed something strange. He was coughing quietly. Wiping his forehead again and again, she caught his eye once, and he smiled weakly before turning back to the keys. Not long after, the music stopped suddenly. The sound cut off like a candle snuffed out, and a few guests looked up in confusion. The pianist stood, pale and sweating, holding his stomach. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the manager. "I need to sit down." Mr. Collins's face turned red, his eyes wide with panic. The gala was far from over, and now the music, the one thing holding the atmosphere together, and was gone. The manager rushed to the staff area, his voice low but sharp. "We need a replacement," he muttered. "The guests are expecting live music." One of the waiters shrugged helplessly. "We don't have anyone else." "Sir?" Elena froze where she stood, her heart beating faster. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her tray. She knew she shouldn't speak, but the words escaped her lips before she could stop them. I can play," she said softly. Everyone turned to look at her. The manager blinked in disbelief. "You?" he asked, as if he hadn't heard right. Elena nodded, her voice steadier now. "I've played before. I can help until he feels better." For a second, silence hung in the air like a held breath. Then the manager sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine, but make it quick, don't embarrass us." He gestured toward the piano, and Elena's heart began to race. She walked toward the grand piano, her steps slow but sure. The room was still filled with soft conversation, but she felt every eye turning to her. Her hands felt heavy, her chest tight. Her throat dry, she sat down, adjusting the bench, her reflection glimmering faintly on the piano's black surface. For a brief moment, she stared at her own hands, the same hands that had carried trays for months, now resting on ivory keys again. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but her mind went calm. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to play. At first, the sound was gentle, uncertain, but as her fingers found their rhythm, something inside her opened. The notes began to flow, pure and bright, filling the hall with warmth. Conversations quieted, heads turned, and soon the entire room fell silent. The guests looked toward the stage, confused at first, then mesmerized. The girl they had barely noticed all evening was now creating something magical. The melody rose and fell like a story, full of emotion, full of life. The famous producer, seated near the center, leaned forward, listening closely. Elena didn't see them, didn't hear the applause that began to ripple through the crowd. In that moment, it was just her and the piano. Every note she played was a piece of her story, the struggles, the sacrifices, the dreams she thought she had lost. Her hands moved faster, her heart lighter, as if the piano had been waiting for her all along. When the final note lingered in the air, the silence that followed was deep and powerful. Then came the applause, strong and real. Echoing through the restaurant like thunder, Mr. Collins stood frozen, his mouth open in disbelief. The guests cheered. The producer clapped slowly with a knowing smile, and Elena sat there, tears shining in her eyes. She had come to work that evening as a waitress, but she was leaving it as something far greater. The girl who played the piano, the girl who made the world stop and listen. A night that none of them would ever forget. A night that was only just beginning when the last note faded. The room remained silent for a heartbeat. Then the applause came, soft at first, then louder, stronger. Like a wave rolling through the hall, people who had ignored her minutes ago were now standing, their eyes wide, their hands clapping hard. Elena sat frozen at the piano, her fingers still resting on the keys. She could hardly believe what had just happened. Mr. Collins, the manager, stood near the bar, blinking rapidly as if unsure what he had witnessed. He had expected a disaster, something awkward and forgettable instead. His quiet waitress had just stolen the entire evening. The guests were whispering excitedly, asking who she was, where she had learned to play, and in that moment, Elena's heart raced not with fear, but with something she hadn't felt in years: pride. She stood slowly and gave a small, nervous smile. The famous music producer, seated at the center table, leaned forward with curiosity. He clapped last deliberately, his eyes fixed on her. There was something in his expression, surprise, but also recognition, the kind of look that said, "I see something special." The applause faded, and the piano stood waiting, silent again. Elena turned toward Mr. Collins, unsure what to do. He motioned for her to continue, whispering, "Play another one." Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected that, but her fingers were already tingling. Eager to move again, she sat back down, took a slow breath, and began a softer melody. This time she didn't just play, she spoke through the keys. The notes told a story only she understood. It was about dreams lost and rediscovered, about loneliness, courage, and hope. Every sound floated gently through the air, touching hearts that didn't know they needed healing. The lights above glowed warmer. The room hushed completely. Waiters stopped moving, guests leaned forward. Even the sound of champagne being poured was forgotten. Her music filled every corner of the room, wrapping it in emotion, and when she reached the final note, it lingered long enough to leave goosebumps on every listener's skin. When she looked up again, there were tears in some of the guests' eyes. A woman near the front placed a hand over her chest and whispered, "Beautiful." Elena felt her cheeks flush. She didn't know where to look. The manager smiled at her for the first time that night. A real smile, not the forced one he usually wore. And then, from across the room, the producer stood up. He walked toward her slowly, clapping as he came closer. The crowd parted slightly, all eyes following him. When he reached the piano, he extended his hand. That, he said with a deep voice, was extraordinary. Elena hesitated, then shook his hand, still trembling slightly. Thank you, she whispered, barely able to breathe. What's your name? He asked. Elena, she said softly. Elena Reyes. He nodded thoughtfully, repeating it under his breath as if committing it to memory. You play with heart, not just skill, he said. And that's rare, she smiled shyly, unsure how to respond before she could say anything more. Someone called for an encore. The crowd began to cheer again, urging her to play another. Elena laughed nervously. Glancing at the manager for approval, he nodded quickly, mouthing, Go ahead. So she placed her fingers on the keys once more, and this time she let everything go. She played like the world had stopped spinning, like the years of silence were melting away with each note. Her music became brighter, freer, alive. It danced through the room like firelight, and for the first time in so long, Elena wasn't afraid of being seen. She finished with a flourish, her final chord strong and clear. The applause was thunderous. Louder than before, people were standing, clapping, smiling, some even recording her on their phones. The producer turned to Mr. Collins and said quietly, She's remarkable, you should be proud. Mr. Collins simply nodded, still too stunned to speak as the guests began to leave. Many stopped by to thank her. A woman in pearls pressed her hand and said, You reminded me of why I love music. Another man offered her his card, saying, Call me if you ever perform again. Elena thanked them all politely, her heart still racing. She felt like she was floating, part dream, part disbelief. When the last guest left and the lights dimmed, she sat alone at the piano for a moment. The restaurant was quiet again, just the faint hum of the air conditioning in the background. She placed her hand on the piano's surface, tracing its smooth edge. Thank you, she whispered to it, as if it were alive, because in her heart, she knew this piano had given her more than music that night. It had given her courage. Mr. Collins approached her with a small grin. I didn't know you could play like that, he said. Half proud, half amazed, Elena shrugged lightly. I used to, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Well, he said, you should never have stopped, she smiled. Not with sadness this time, but with quiet confidence. Maybe she really shouldn't have stopped. As she walked home that night, the city lights seemed to glow differently. The cool wind brushed her face and she felt alive in a way she hadn't for years. Every sound and the traffic, the footsteps, even the hum of the streetlights, and felt like music to her. Her fingers still tingled from playing, as if the notes were still alive inside her skin. She looked up at the night sky and whispered, Thank you, Papa. Somewhere in her heart, she could almost hear him say, I told you. Those hands were made for music. That night, Elena barely slept. She kept replaying the moment over and over. The keys, the applause, the faces in awe. The way her heart had opened when she touched the piano again. It felt like a second chance. One she didn't even know she was waiting for. Little did she know, that night's performance had already started a chain of events that would change everything. Her chance at the keys was not just a moment. It was the beginning of her return to music. And soon the world would hear her name again. The next morning, sunlight slipped gently through Elena's thin curtains, touching her face like a soft reminder of the night before. She opened her eyes slowly, unsure if what had happened was real or just a dream. For a few seconds, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, replaying every sound, every note, every face from last night. Then she smiled in a real, full smile, the kind she hadn't felt in years. It was real. It had all happened. She sat up quickly, her heart racing again. The memory of applause echoed in her ears, the warmth of the piano keys still tingling in her fingertips. She looked at her small keyboard by the window and whispered, We did it, as if speaking to an old friend. Her tiny apartment, once quiet and lonely, now felt alive. It was as if music had moved back in, filling every corner with light. When she arrived at work later that day, the restaurant was buzzing with whispers. Her co-workers turned to look at her with wide eyes, grins spreading across their faces. Star of the night, one of them teased playfully, and another clapped as she walked in. Even Mr. Collins, the usually serious manager, greeted her with a smile. You caused quite a storm last night, he said, shaking his head. People haven't stopped talking about you. Elena blushed, trying to hide her excitement. She didn't want to get carried away. It had been one performance. Nothing more. But deep down, something told her it wasn't just one performance. Something had shifted, something big. The producer, the man in the gray suit who had watched her so intently, had spoken to her after the show. He had given her his card and said, "I'd like to hear you play again." She had kept that card carefully, tucked inside her notebook like a secret treasure. Now as she worked, she couldn't stop thinking about it. His name was Daniel Warren, a respected figure in the music world. He had discovered some of the most talented pianists and singers in the country. The thought of him even noticing her felt impossible yet thrilling. That afternoon, while cleaning tables after the lunch rush, she took out the card again. Her hands trembled slightly as she traced his name with her fingers. She wondered if she should call him or if it would seem too eager. Maybe he was just being polite. Maybe he said that to everyone. But then she remembered the way he had looked at her. Not with pity, but with respect. That look had meant something. She was sure of it after work. She finally gathered her courage. She walked home quickly, her heart thudding in her chest the whole way. She rehearsed what she would say on the phone. "Hello, Mr. Warren. This is Elena from the restaurant," she murmured under her breath, practicing her tone. But when she reached her apartment, her courage wavered. She sat on her bed, staring at the phone, afraid to make the call. Minutes turned into an hour, the city outside humming softly. Finally, she took a deep breath and dialed the number. Each ring made her heart pound louder. Then a calm voice answered. Daniel Warren speaking. For a moment, Elena couldn't speak at all. Her throat had gone dry. "Hello, sir, this is Elena Reyes, the waitress who played the piano last night," she said quickly, almost tripping over her words. There was a pause and then a warm chuckle. Elena," he said, "I was hoping you'd call." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected that. "I meant what I said," he continued. "You have something rare, raw emotion, natural talent, and honesty in your music. I'd like you to come by my studio this weekend. Just to play a little, no pressure?" Elena's heart leapt. She tried to keep her voice calm. "I'd love to, thank you, sir." When she hung up, she pressed the phone against her chest and laughed softly. It felt like magic, like the universe had just opened a door she never knew still existed. She spun around her small apartment, whispering to herself, "This is really happening." The next few days felt like a dream. She worked as usual, but everything seemed brighter. The sounds, the colors, even the smell of coffee in the mornings. When Saturday finally arrived, she woke up early and dressed carefully. She chose a simple blue dress, the one her mother had sewn for her years ago. It wasn't fancy, but it made her feel confident. She tied her hair neatly, took a deep breath, and looked at herself in the mirror. "Let's find out if we still belong in that world," she whispered. Daniel's studio was on the top floor of an old building overlooking the city. When she entered, she was struck by the walls lined with gold records and framed photos. Pianos, microphones, and sound equipment filled the room. It smelled faintly of wood and polish. Daniel greeted her warmly and led her to a glossy black grand piano. "This is where the magic happens," he said with a smile. Elena sat down, her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to play. The melody was soft and pure, filled with quiet emotion. Daniel listened carefully, nodding slowly when she finished. He didn't speak immediately, just smiled. "You've got something special, Elena," he said finally. "And the world needs to hear it." Tears filled her eyes. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. He continued, "If you're willing, I'll help you record a piece. Nothing big at first, just something to share online." Her hands shook as she covered her mouth in shock. "Are you serious?" she whispered. He laughed kindly. "Very serious, but only if you promise me one thing." "What's that?" she asked softly. "Don't ever stop playing again," he said. That night, Elena walked home under a sky full of stars. The city lights shimmered around her, and for the first time, she didn't feel small beneath them. Her life had changed in a single moment. A simple chance at the keys had turned into a doorway back to her dreams. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she didn't care because for the first time in years, the world had heard her heart, and this time, she wasn't going to let the music fade away. This was the moment that changed everything. The sound of her music spread faster than she ever imagined. It began as a quiet whisper, a small video recorded by a guest at the gala. Someone had posted it online with the caption, "Waitress shocks the wealthy with an unbelievable piano performance." Within hours, people began sharing it, commenting and wondering who the mysterious girl behind the piano was. By the next morning, the video had thousands of views. By the next week, it had millions. Elena had no idea at first. She was busy working, wiping tables, serving coffee, and living her ordinary days. It wasn't until one of her co-workers ran up to her, breathless and grinning, that she found out. "Elena, you're all over the internet," he shouted, waving his phone. She blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked. He turned the screen toward her, and there it was, and her sitting at the piano, eyes closed, lost in the music. She watched herself in disbelief, hearing every note, seeing every emotion. People were commenting things like, "She plays like she's telling a story," and "That's real talent." Not fame. Her hands began to shake, not from fear but from shock. Her co-workers gathered around, smiling, clapping her on the back. Even Mr. Collins, who rarely showed emotion, looked proud. "I guess the world finally noticed what we already knew," he said softly. Elena didn't know what to say, her eyes filled with tears, her heart pounding in her chest. That evening, she called Daniel Warren to tell him about it. He already knew, of course, his voice cheerful and calm on the phone. "I told you, Elena," he said. "People can feel your heart when you play." He invited her back to the studio. "It's time we record something properly," he added. She couldn't stop smiling. "I'll be there," she promised. The next few days felt like a dream she didn't want to wake up from. Strangers recognized her on the street. Some stopped her to say how much her music had touched them. An old man at the bus stop told her, "My wife cried listening to your song. Thank you for that." A young girl in a school uniform ran up and said shyly, "I want to learn piano like you." Every word felt like magic, like a spark of hope returning to her life. When she returned to Daniel's studio, he had already set up everything: a microphone, a camera, and a glossy piano under soft light. "This time," he said, "you're not playing for guests or fancy people. You're playing for the world." Elena nodded, took a deep breath, and sat down at the piano. Her fingers rested gently on the keys. Her heart full but calm, she began to play a new melody, one she had written herself. It started quietly, almost like a whisper, then grew stronger, filled with emotion and grace. Daniel watched from behind the glass, smiling as he listened. When she finished, the room fell silent, the kind of silence that comes when words aren't enough. Daniel pressed the talk button and said, "That was perfect." "Elena." They uploaded the recording that same evening. He titled it "The Waitress Who Found Her Music Again." Within a day, it reached thousands of people. Comments poured in from around the world. From Paris, Tokyo, Mumbai, New York, people wrote about how her music made them cry, how it reminded them of their own forgotten dreams. Some said it gave them hope. Others said it made them believe in miracles again. Elena sat in her apartment reading every message, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe so many strangers felt connected to her story. She realized then that music wasn't just sound, it was emotion, memory, healing. It crossed borders, languages and pain, reaching people she would never meet. Her small dream had become something much bigger than herself. One evening, she returned to the restaurant where it all began. The piano stood in the same place, but everything felt different now. Mr. Collins greeted her with a warm smile. "You know, people keep asking if you still work here," he joked. She laughed. "I think I might have been promoted," she said softly. He chuckled. "You'll always have a place here." Elena, as she sat at the piano again, the staff gathered around. She began to play, not for fame, not for recording, but for the people who had been there since the start. Her co-workers listened quietly. The same people who used to tease her now standing in awe. Even the guests who came in that night recognized her, whispering, "That's her. That's the girl from the video." But Elena didn't care about the attention. Her eyes were closed, her heart open, her music flowing freely. When she finished, the small crowd clapped warmly. A child near the counter shouted, "Play again," and everyone laughed. Elena smiled, realizing how beautiful this moment was, and not grand, not loud, just full of love. That's when Daniel walked in, holding his phone, his expression bright. "You did it," he said. "Your video just passed 10 million views." The room erupted in cheers, her co-workers hugging her, the manager clapping loudly. Elena laughed through her tears, her joy overflowing. Daniel handed her his phone, and she read one particular comment out loud. It said, "She reminded me that it's never too late to start again." Her voice trembled, her heart swelling with emotion. "That's what I wanted," she whispered, for people to feel that later that night. As the restaurant lights dimmed, Elena sat alone by the piano again. She ran her fingers across the keys, softly playing a lullaby. She thought about the people who had watched her, listened to her, believed in her. Her father, her mother, her co-workers, Daniel, the strangers who left kind words, every one of them had become part of her song. She looked around the empty restaurant, her old workplace, her first stage, and she smiled to herself, whispering, "This is where it all began." Because it wasn't just about fame or success anymore. It was about connection, courage, and rediscovering the light she thought she had lost. The audience's reaction hadn't just changed her life. It had given her purpose. And from that night on, every song she played carried that same message. That no dream is ever too far away and no heart is ever too late to listen again. Fame didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, like morning light slipping through the curtains. Every day brought something new. Another interview request, another phone call, another person wanting to meet her. Elena could hardly keep up. One moment she was serving tables, and the next, people were asking for her autograph. The girl who had once lived in silence now had a world that wanted to hear her every note. At first it felt unreal. She would wake up and still half expect to go to work, put on her apron and carry trays. But now her days were filled with rehearsals, recordings, and meetings. Daniel guided her through everything, patient and kind, treating her not like a star but like family. "You earned this," he told her. "Don't ever think you got lucky, you worked for it." His words gave her strength when things began to feel overwhelming. Her first professional recording was released just 3 months after her viral video. It was called Hands of Hope, a simple piano piece she wrote late one night when she couldn't sleep. The melody was soft, emotional, filled with longing and quiet strength. When it was uploaded, it climbed the charts faster than anyone expected. Radio stations played it, TV shows used it, and millions of people downloaded it. Suddenly, Elena wasn't just the waitress who played, she was Elena Reyes, the new name in music despite the sudden attention. She tried to stay humble. She still visited the restaurant sometimes, not to work but to say hello. Her co-workers would cheer and tease her. "Don't forget us when you're famous," they'd say. She would laugh and reply, "You're the ones who saw me before the world did." And every time she walked past that grand piano, she'd touch it gently, whispering, "Thank you." But fame, like music, comes with both highs and lows. As her schedule filled with interviews and performances, exhaustion began to creep in. Some nights she stayed up until dawn practicing. Her hands ached, her eyes burned, but she refused to stop. She didn't want to lose the magic she had fought so hard to find. Daniel noticed the tiredness in her eyes. One evening, after a long recording session, he said, "Elena, you need rest." She shook her head, smiling weakly. "Music doesn't wait," he sighed. "No, but your heart does, and if you don't take care of it, the music will fade." His words stayed with her that night, echoing in her mind as she lay awake staring at the ceiling. She realized then that success wasn't about running faster. It was about learning when to pause. The next morning, she took a break. She went to visit her mother in their old neighborhood, a small place filled with simple people and warm smiles. Her mother was frail but bright-eyed. Proud of her daughter's growing fame, they sat together drinking tea, watching the sunset paint the sky gold. Her mother reached out, held her hand, and said softly, "I always knew you'd come back to the piano." Elena smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I almost didn't, Mama," she whispered. "But it never really left you," her mother said. "It was waiting inside you all along." That visit changed something in her. She realized that music wasn't about fame or numbers. It was about connection. It was about people like her mother, who found comfort in her melodies. It was about strangers who wrote letters saying her songs helped them heal, and most of all, it was about the little girl she once was, the one who dreamed by the radio with her father. Soon after, Daniel arranged her first live concert. It was a small theater, only a few hundred seats. But for Elena, it felt like the world. When she stepped onto the stage that night, her knees trembled, her breath caught in her chest. The lights were bright. The audience quiet, waiting. She sat at the piano, closed her eyes, and whispered to herself, "This is for everyone who believed." The first note rang out clear and strong. Then another and another. Her fingers moved with confidence. her heart guiding every sound. The crowd listened in silence, completely captivated. When the final note faded, the applause was deafening. Tears streamed down Elena's face as she stood to bow. This was the moment she had dreamed of as a child, and not the fame, not the lights, but the feeling of being heard. After the concert, people lined up to meet her. Some handed her flowers, others simply said, "Thank you." A little girl gave her a handmade card that said, "You make me believe I can do it too." Elena hugged her gently. "You can," she whispered. Never stop believing. She realized then that her journey was no longer just about herself. Her story had become a message of hope for others. Backstage, Daniel smiled proudly. "You've come a long way, Elena." She laughed softly, wiping her tears. "And to think it all started because someone needed a pianist." He chuckled. "Sometimes destiny hides in the strangest places." She nodded, her heart full. "I think destiny was always there. I just needed the courage to say yes." That night, as she looked out from the theater balcony at the city lights, she remembered her tiny apartment, her thrift store keyboard, and the long nights when she almost gave up. Every struggle, every tear, every lonely shift at the restaurant had led to this moment. She whispered to the wind, "Papa, I made it." And though she couldn't hear him, she felt it, a warmth in her chest. Like a silent applause from heaven, this was her turning point. Not just in career, but in spirit. She had found her voice again, not just as a pianist, but as a person who had survived. The waitress who once played for silence was now playing for the world. And she knew, deep in her soul, that this was only the beginning of her song. Years had passed since that unforgettable evening in the restaurant. The night that changed everything. The night when a quiet waitress dared to touch the piano and let her heart speak. Now, Elena's name was known far beyond her city. Her music had traveled across countries, oceans and hearts. She had performed in grand theaters, appeared on television, and shared her story with the world. But no matter how far she went, she never forgot where it all began. Her life was full now, lights, travel, applause, and endless melodies, yet sometimes, between performances, she would close her eyes and remember the smell of coffee, the clinking of glasses, and the sound of laughter in that restaurant. That place had been her world once, small but safe, quiet but full of dreams she didn't even realize were still alive. Now every note she played was a tribute to that place, to that version of herself who never stopped hoping. One evening, Daniel surprised her with an idea. He said, "You know, it's been years since that first performance. What if we go back there just for one night?" Elena blinked, smiling softly. "Back to the restaurant?" He nodded. "Yes, let's make it a private concert. A thank you to the people who saw you before anyone else did." Her heart warmed instantly. "I'd love that," she said. The restaurant had changed a little over the years, but its soul was the same. The chandelier still sparkled like stars. The piano still stood proudly in the corner. When Elena walked in that night, memories flooded her mind. She saw herself again, tired, nervous, invisible, carrying trays with trembling hands. She almost laughed, thinking how that same girl had unknowingly stepped into her destiny right there. The staff greeted her with excitement and affection. Some were new, but a few familiar faces remained. Her old co-workers, now older, wiser, and prouder than ever. Mr. Collins, her former manager, hugged her tightly. "You really did it, didn't you?" he said with a grin. Elena smiled. "We did it. All of us," she replied. He laughed, wiping his eyes quickly, pretending it was just dust. The evening began quietly. With soft chatter and candlelight, only a small group of people were invited. Friends, family, and the few who had witnessed that first magical performance. Daniel took the microphone and spoke gently. "Tonight isn't about fame or success," he said. "It's about remembering where courage begins." Then he turned to Elena and added, "And it began right here." Elena sat down at the piano, the same one that had started it all. Her hands rested on the keys, and for a moment she couldn't move. The weight of the moment settled in her heart, not heavy but deep. She looked up, meeting the eyes of everyone in the room, and smiled. "This piano gave me back my life," she whispered, "and tonight, I want to give it something in return." The first note echoed through the air. Warm and familiar, the melody was soft, tender, full of love and memory. It wasn't a song of sorrow, nor one of triumph. It was a song of gratitude. Every note was a thank you to her father, her mother, her co-workers, Daniel, and even herself. Her fingers danced lightly, gracefully, as if they were painting her journey in sound. People listened in complete silence, some with eyes closed, some with tears glistening in the candlelight. When she reached the final chord, she let it linger in the air for a long, beautiful second, then she lifted her hands, and the room filled with applause, not loud and wild, but warm and full of love. Elena stood and bowed, tears streaming down her face. But she was smiling too, because this was not just a performance, and it was a homecoming. After the music ended, people gathered around her, sharing hugs and memories. An old waiter said, "I still remember that night you looked so scared." And she laughed. "I was." Her mother, sitting in the front row, wiped her eyes and whispered, "You made your father proud." Elena squeezed her hand gently. "I felt him here tonight," she said softly. Even Daniel looked emotional, though he tried to hide it behind a proud smile. When the guests had gone and the lights dimmed, Elena stayed behind for a moment. The restaurant was quiet again, just like it had been on that first night. She sat alone at the piano, tracing the smooth keys with her fingertips. She whispered, "You never gave up on me, did you?" and smiled through her tears. She began to play softly, not for anyone else, just for herself. The melody floated through the empty room like a whisper of time. Each note carried a story, of dreams lost, rediscovered and fulfilled. It was the sound of her life, her struggles, her victories, her love for music that never truly left. When she finished, she closed her eyes and listened to the quiet, a quiet that wasn't lonely anymore, but peaceful, complete. As she stood to leave, she turned one last time to look at the piano. In that moment, she realized something powerful. Success wasn't the applause or the fame. It was the courage to keep believing when no one was watching. It was the moment she chose to play, even when she was scared. It was the promise she made to herself that night, to never stop creating beauty. No matter what, she stepped outside, the night air cool and gentle against her skin. The city glowed around her, the same city that had once felt too big, too far, too impossible. Now it felt like home. She looked up at the sky, where the stars shimmered quietly, and she whispered, "A night to remember," because it truly was. Not just one night, but many. The night she lost hope, the night she found courage, the night she played again. Every one of those nights had shaped her into who she was. And somewhere out there, another girl was dreaming by a window, listening to her music and believing that maybe, just maybe, her time would come too. Elena smiled, took a deep breath, and walked away into the soft glow of the streetlights. Her story was not over. It was only changing shape, turning into a melody that would never fade. The waitress who once hid behind silence had become the woman who spoke through sound, and her song, the one born from courage, loss and love, and would live on forever, a night to remember, and a heart that would always keep playing,